parchment trembled in the court herald's hands. Every vampire in the great underground chamber beneath London's financial district had gone completely, dangerously still. Amara Langley stood at the edge of the observation gallery, a human woman in a room full of immortal predators, and felt the temperature of the air drop by several degrees as the herald's voice rang out across the black marble floor below. By order of the High Nocturnal Court, the lineage of the Karnstein bloodline shall now be read in full, as demanded by the Conclave of 7, in the matter of the disputed succession to the throne of Dusk. Amara's fingers tightened around her sketchbook. She had been hired 3 weeks ago to document the court proceedings in charcoal and ink, a human artist, a neutral party, employed because vampires distrusted cameras, and because her work had reached even the underground galleries of the immortal world. She had told herself it was the opportunity of a lifetime. She had told herself she could remain detached. She had been wrong about almost everything because standing at the center of the chamber below, dressed in a coat so dark it seemed to consume light, with white hair pulled severely back and silver eyes fixed on the herald, with the cold patience of something ancient and immovable, was Aurelian Karnstein. And Amara had been sketching his face for 3 weeks, without understanding what she had already known in her hands, before her mind caught up. The herald began to read the lineage aloud. Names rolled out like stones dropped into deep water. Ancient names, Gothic names that carried weight and violence and centuries. Vampiric titles in languages that predated English by 1,000 years. The other members of the court, the Conclave of 7, seated on their curved dais of black iron, watched with expressions ranging from cold satisfaction to barely concealed hunger. This reading had been forced upon the court. Someone had wanted this. Someone had designed this moment to destroy Aurelian Karnstein, and then the herald reached the crest. The House of Karnstein bears the crest of the bleeding crescent and the blackthorn crown, as established in the Covenant of Valdris, sealed in blood in the year 1143. Amara stopped breathing because she had drawn that crest. She had drawn it from memory 3 days ago, sitting in a coffee shop above ground, trying to capture a detail she had noticed carved into the inside of Aurelian's coat collar. A tiny, obsessive detail she had included in her most recent sketch because she could not leave anything incomplete. She had drawn the bleeding crescent. She had drawn the crown of thorns. And then, because her mind never stopped connecting patterns, she had opened the research book she always carried and cross-referenced it with the heraldic archives she had been studying since accepting this commission. The crest in the book matched, but the crest in the book was not labeled as belonging to the Karnstein line. It was labeled as belonging to the Valdris primogeniture, the original founding lineage of the entire nocturnal court system. The line that had supposedly died out 4 centuries ago. The line whose extinction had allowed the Conclave of 7 to seize power in the first place. If Aurelian's crest was the Valdris crest, then Aurelian was not merely a noble heir. He was the rightful sovereign of every vampire court in existence, and someone in that chamber already knew it. The Conclave member seated at the far left of the dais, a skeletal woman with champagne white hair, named Lady Seraphiel, leaned forward with an expression Amara recognized as the artilitical equivalent of a blade being drawn. She had been studying these faces for 3 weeks. She knew what satisfaction looked like when it wore a mask of neutrality. "Herald," Seraphiel said, her voice carrying the effortless authority of something that had been frightening people for 600 years. Continue with the forbidden addendum. The herald's hands shook more visibly now. My lady, the forbidden addendum to the Karnst lineage has been sealed under blood law since I am's unsealing it. By the authority of the Conclave of 7, in session, with full quorum, read it. Below, Aurelian had not moved. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture so controlled it looked architectural, and he watched Seraphiel with silver eyes that gave nothing away. But Amara had drawn those eyes enough times to know the difference between Aurelian at rest and Aurelian preparing for something. The slight tightening at the corners, the almost imperceptible way his weight had shifted forward onto the balls of his feet. He had known this was coming. The herald unfolded a second parchment, this one older, the edges brown and soft with age, the writing on it so faded it required the herald to hold it at an angle to the candlelight. When he read, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, and yet in the perfect acoustics of the underground chamber, every word landed with the force of something thrown. The Karnstein blood, descended through the unbroken line of Valdris I, carries the true crest of primogeniture, the mark of sovereign right over all courts of night. This lineage was hidden by blood oath at the request of Valdris himself, to protect the heir from destruction at the hands of those who would seize power upon his passing. The heir bearing the true crest shall be known by the mark of the bleeding crescent on the inner left wrist, present from the moment of their first blood rite. Every eye in the chamber turned to Aurelian. He did not look at his wrist. He did not need to. He simply held Lady Seraphiel's gaze, with the absolute stillness of someone who had been carrying this secret for a very long time, and had decided in this moment that he was done running from it. Well, he said, and his voice was quiet and precise and perfectly, terrifyingly calm. Now we understand each other. Up in the gallery, Amara pressed herself back against the stone wall and tried to make herself small. Her sketchbook was open to the drawing she had done 3 days ago. The Valdris crest stared up at her from the page, rendered in her own charcoal, the bleeding crescent, the black thorn crown, undeniable, documented, existing in the handwriting of a neutral human observer. She had accidentally created evidence. And from the way Lady Seraphiel's pale eyes moved upward to the gallery with the slow, satisfied precision of a predator who had just finished setting a trap, Amara understood with cold clarity that this had never been an accident at all. She had been placed here, hired specifically because of her eye for detail and her compulsive documentation. Someone had used her to create the proof that would bring this moment about. The question was whether that someone was Seraphiel, who clearly wanted to use the revelation as a weapon against Aurelian, or Aurelian himself, who had known this was coming and had said nothing to warn her. Amara did not have time to work out the answer, because in the next breath, 2 members of the Conclave's guard were moving toward the gallery stairs, and Lady Seraphiel was speaking again in that smooth, terrible voice. Detain the human artist. Her documentation of the true crest constitutes a blood law violation under the Pact of Hidden Things. Any human who bears witness to a forbidden lineage and records it must be brought before the court. The sketchbook in Amara's hands suddenly felt like a weapon pointed at her own chest. She moved. Not panicked, not stumbling, Amara Langley had grown up in neighborhoods where knowing when to move and where to move was a survival skill developed long before she ever encountered vampires. She crossed the gallery in 6 steps, ducked through the narrow maintenance corridor she had mapped during her first day on the commission, because she always mapped exits and came out on the upper level of the chamber's eastern wall just as the guards reached the gallery stairs. Below her, she could see the full chamber. She could see Aurelian. He had turned. He had found her immediately, with those silver eyes that cut through distance and darkness without effort, and something crossed his face that she had never drawn because she had never seen it before, something raw and urgent and completely at war with the composed mask he wore for everyone else. He moved toward the eastern wall. The conclave erupted, voices overlapping. The formal structure of the court session, dissolving into the chaos of something that had been a political assassination attempt, pivoting into something messier and more honest. 2 of the 7 were on their feet. Lady Seraphiel was speaking with cold precision about blood law and the rights of the court and the obligation of the heir to submit to examination. Aurelian crossed the chamber floor with the unhurried, absolute confidence of something that had decided it was done submitting to anything. "The session is dissolved," he said, and his voice carried with such natural authority that 3 guards actually stopped moving before they remembered they answered to the conclave. "The human artist is under my protection as a commissioned neutral party of this court. Any action taken against her constitutes a violation of the neutrality covenant, which predates every blood law the conclave has invoked tonight. You will stand down." A beat of silence, then Seraphiel, slowly and deliberately, smiled. "The neutrality covenant protects human observers from harm," she said. "It does not protect them from lawful detention when they have committed a blood law violation. And it certainly does not apply when the human in question has been used, knowingly or not, to document a forbidden lineage. Take her." The guards moved again. Aurelian was faster. He was at the base of the eastern wall before the guards were halfway across the chamber, moving with the liquid speed of old blood and absolute intent. He reached up, and Amara, who had already calculated the drop and decided she would rather break an ankle than be detained by the Conclave, dropped into his arms with exactly the kind of practical decisiveness that had characterized every choice she had made in the last 3 weeks. He caught her as though she weighed nothing. His arms were like stone, wrapped in warmth, and his silver eyes met hers at a distance of approximately 4 inches, and the thing she had been refusing to name for 3 weeks pressed itself against the inside of her chest with considerable force. "I need to explain several things to you," he said quietly, holding her gaze. "You do. Starting with whether you used me." Something moved through his expression. Not guilt. Exactly. Older than guilt. "Starting with getting you out of here." He set her down, kept one hand wrapped around her wrist, not restrictively, but with the deliberate, unmistakable message of someone communicating mind to every predator in the room, and walked toward the eastern corridor exit with the kind of unhurried authority that made the guards hesitate just long enough. They were through the corridor and into the service tunnels beneath the building. Before the chamber fully reorganized itself, the tunnels were a labyrinth Amara had mapped partially, but not completely. Aurelian moved through them with the certainty of someone who had walked them in total darkness for longer than the building above had existed. He did not release her wrist. She did not ask him to. The sounds of the court faded behind them, replaced by the deep hum of the city's underground infrastructure, electrical conduits, water mains, the rhythmic heartbeat of urban civilization existing entirely ignorant of what moved beneath it. They surfaced through a passage that emerged inside a private parking structure in the city district, concrete and fluorescent and brutally ordinary. Aurelian had a vehicle, of course he did, something black and low and European, with tinted windows rated several levels above legal, and they were inside it and moving before Amara had fully processed the last 40 minutes. She sat in the passenger seat with her sketchbook on her lap and looked at him driving and thought about what it meant that her hands were steady. "The Conclave hired me," she said. It was not a question. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, someone did. I was recruited specifically because of my eye for detail and my documentation style. I have been sketching your coat collar and the crest on your possessions for 3 weeks without realizing I was building a case file. That does not happen by accident." He was quiet for long enough that the silence became an answer. "I recruited you," he said. Amara absorbed this. The city moved past the windows, the ordinary, illuminated, unknowing city. People walking, shops still lit, the entire ordinary world entirely unaware. "Explain," she said. He drove for another block before he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the quality she had come to recognize as his version of complete honesty. Stripped of the performance he maintained in the court, deliberate and precise and uncomfortably direct. "I have known about my lineage for 11 years. I chose to keep it hidden because the moment it became known, the Conclave would move to eliminate me. A dead heir resolves the succession question far more neatly than a living one. But I cannot remain hidden indefinitely. The blood law requires the true crest to be acknowledged and entered into the record within a sovereign's first century. If I fail to declare it, the lineage dies with me and the Conclave's illegitimate authority becomes permanent. I needed the crest documented by a neutral party whose work could not be dismissed as fabricated by my own house. So you needed a human observer who would document what she saw without understanding what she was documenting. Yes, and you chose me. I have followed your work for 2 years. Your accuracy is extraordinary. Your eye for architectural and heraldic detail is unmatched, and you do not frighten easily." He paused. "I needed someone who would survive the court long enough to complete the documentation." Amara looked down at her sketchbook. 3 weeks of work, dozens of drawings, all of them, she now understood, pieces of something larger than she had been told. "You should have told me," she said. "If I had told you, the documentation would have been intentional. It would have been dismissed as directed evidence. The neutrality covenant only protects work produced without knowledge of the political stakes." "I understand the logic. I still think you should have told me." Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke, his voice had changed to something quieter and more careful, like a man navigating territory he did not fully trust his footing in. "You are correct," he said. "I weighed the strategic necessity against your right to informed consent, and I chose the strategy. That's was wrong, I am sorry." Amara to look at him properly for the first time since they had left the court. This close, in the reflected city light, he was exactly as her charcoal had rendered him. The sharp geometry of a face that had stopped aging somewhere in its early 30s. The white hair that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with what he was. The silver eyes that held light differently than human eyes, as though they were generating some of it themselves, pale as marble, composed as a cathedral. And underneath all of it in this moment, something uncomfortably human, he had apologized. Without qualification, without redirection, without immediately pivoting to the strategic justification. He had simply said he was wrong and he was sorry. Amara had spent 3 weeks watching him operate in the court, watching him navigate political violence with centuries of practice, and she had never seen him apologize to anyone. She exhaled slowly. "Where are we going?" "My house. It is the only location in this city where I can guarantee your safety tonight. The Conclave will have people watching your apartment within the hour." "I want to know everything," she said. "The full lineage, what the Valdris primogeniture means, what the Conclave's next move will be, what my legal standing is under the blood law they cited. I know, and I want to know what comes next for you, whether declaring the lineage actually changes anything, or whether it just makes you a larger target." "It changes everything," he said quietly. "If the true Crest is acknowledged by the court record, and it has been tonight, by a neutral observer whose documentation was produced under the Neutrality Covenant, then the Conclave's authority becomes challengeable. Every decision they have made for 4 centuries can be contested. The courts of the night across Europe, Asia, and the Americas will have to recognize the primogeniture claim. It does not happen overnight. There will be a period of extreme danger, but the foundation has been laid, and you cannot use me to build a case without my explicit consent going forward." "No," he said, "I cannot. Good. Then I am giving it." He glanced at her then, a quick, sharp look that contained more surprise than she expected from someone who had been alive for centuries and had presumably encountered most categories of human response. "You understand what you are agreeing to," he said. "I understand that I have accidentally become part of a vampire succession crisis, and that my sketchbook is now the most significant piece of evidence in a blood law proceeding, and that if I go home and hide under my bed, the Conclave will simply fabricate a blood law violation and use me as a pressure point against you anyway." She met his eyes steadily. "I would rather be an active participant than a passive one. Passive gets you used, and active gets you leverage." The corner of his mouth moved. It was barely a movement at all, a fraction of an expression, but she had spent 3 weeks studying his face, and she recognized it as the closest he came, in public, to something warm. "As you say," he said quietly, his house was not what she had expected. And then again it was exactly what she had expected. Because she had been drawing him for 3 weeks, and she understood something about the shape of a person from the details they allowed to exist around them. It occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Mayfair that looked, from the street, like a converted Georgian townhouse. Inside, it was something else entirely, vast in the way that spaces achieved when every wall had been removed that was not structural, with ceilings 4 meters high and floors of dark stone that absorbed sound and walls lined with things that accrued over a very long time. Maps, manuscripts in cases, paintings so old their varnish had turned amber, books in languages Amara recognized and languages she did not, and everywhere, carved or painted or embroidered into small details she had to look for: the crest, the bleeding crescent, and the black thorn crown, hidden in plain sight. Present in the house the way a heartbeat was present in a body, unremarked, constant, essential. She moved through the entrance hall, running her eyes over every surface, and behind her she heard Aurelian close the door and engage what she suspected were several layers of security that had nothing to do with conventional locks. "Your entire house is covered in it," she said. "Hiding something in plain sight is more effective than concealing it," he said. "Anyone who entered this house already knew I was Karnstein. The crest identifies the house, not the lineage. Most vampires do not know the connection between the Karnstein crest and the Valdris primogeniture. That knowledge was suppressed along with the forbidden addendum. But Seraphiel knew. Seraphiel has known for approximately 50 years. She has been building a case to use the knowledge against me, waiting for the right moment to make the revelation politically advantageous for the Conclave. Amara turned to face him. He was standing near the entrance of what was clearly a study, or the vampire equivalent of one, more library than workspace, with a long table at its center covered in documents and an architectural ditted lamp, throwing warm light across everything. Tonight was her move, Amara said. She forced the reading of the forbidden addendum, planning to use the blood law violation against me as leverage to discredit the documentation I had unknowingly created. Yes, she intended to have you detained. The documentation seized and ruled inadmissible due to the blood law violation, and simultaneously to use the existence of the true Crest as grounds to declare me a political threat and invoke the Conclave's emergency powers to, he paused. To what? To have me executed, he said flatly. Under blood law, an undeclared sovereign heir who remains hidden past his first century constitutes a deliberate deception of the court. The penalty is final death. The room was very quiet for a moment. How old are you? Amara asked. 347 years. And your first century was 170 years ago. I have been in violation of the declaration requirement for 170 years. He said it with the same composure he brought to everything. But beneath it she heard something that she suspected was the closest he came to fear. I had reasons for not declaring earlier. The Conclave's power was too consolidated. Without the documentation of a neutral party, my claim would have been dismissed and I would have been executed on the spot. I was waiting for the right circumstances. And the right circumstances involved finding me. The right circumstances involved finding someone whose work would be unimpeachable. He held her gaze. I had been looking for some time. The way he said it, very quiet, very precise, made Amara understand that he was communicating something beyond the strategic. She filed it away, carefully, in the part of her mind that was not currently occupied with blood law analysis and succession crises. All right, she said, sitting down at the long table and opening her sketchbook. Explain the Valdris primogeniture to me from the beginning. I need to understand the full structure before I can understand what the court record actually accomplished tonight. He sat across from her. He was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those silver eyes, and she had the sense that he was recalibrating something, adjusting to a version of this situation that did not match the one he had planned for. You are not frightened, he said. I was frightened in the chamber when the guards moved toward the gallery. I made practical use of it and then set it aside. She looked at him levelly. Being frightened and being useless are not the same thing. Tell me about Valdris. Something shifted in his expression, something that moved through the composed distance and landed somewhere warmer. He leaned forward onto the table and began to speak. Valdris I had been the oldest vampire in recorded history at the time of his death, or so the court histories claimed. Though Aurelian believed the true age had been obscured even in the original records, he had established the nocturnal court system as a framework for preventing the wars that had consumed the vampire world in the centuries before. Territorial conflicts, bloodline purges, the catastrophic dusk wars of the 9th century that had reduced the global vampire population by 2/3. The system had worked. For 3 centuries, it had created relative stability, governed by a single sovereign lineage, whose authority derived not from violence but from an ancient covenant sealed in Valdris's own blood, When Valdris died, the covenant should have passed to his direct heir. But Valdris had hidden the heir, hidden the entire existence of the child, in fact, out of a paranoia that Aurelian suspected had been entirely justified, given what had happened after. The Conclave of 7, composed of the most powerful noble houses, had stepped into the power vacuum and declared themselves the governing body of the court. They had suppressed knowledge of the true Crest. They had rewritten the blood law to make their authority appear legitimate, and for 4 centuries no one had effectively challenged them, because no heir had survived long enough or found sufficient footing to try. Your ancestors were hidden, Amara said, passed down through a secret lineage, carrying a crest they were forbidden to acknowledge. Yes, each generation knew the truth, but was required to maintain silence. The blood oath Valdris made was not merely political, it was literal. The oath bound the line. Speaking the full truth of the lineage in open court before the right circumstances were established would have triggered an automatic blood law violation that could be used to execute the heir. My ancestors were trapped in a legal framework specifically designed to prevent them from ever safely claiming what was theirs, until the circumstances could be arranged to make the revelation come from someone not bound by the oath. A neutral party, he said, a human observer under the neutrality covenant, who documented the crest without being subject to the blood oath. He paused. Your sketchbook broke the trap. Amara looked down at the drawing, the bleeding crescent, the black thorn crown, done in her steady charcoal hand, unaware, in a coffee shop 3 days ago. Lady Seraphiel tried to turn it into a weapon against you, Amara said. She did not account for the fact that the neutrality covenant's protections for human observers are older than the blood law she cited. In a conflict between the two, precedence goes to age. My advocate argued this successfully in court 5 years ago. In an unrelated case, I made sure of it, specifically to establish the precedent before tonight. Amara stared at him. You prepared the legal precedent 5 years in advance. 3 years in advance, technically. The case was 5 years ago, but the preparation began 8 years before that. He said it without particular pride, simply as a matter of record. You have been planning this for over a decade. Longer in terms of intent. The specific operational planning began approximately 11 years ago, when I confirmed the existence of the full forbidden addendum and understood what it would require to safely surface it. He met her eyes. I apologize again for the aspects of that planning that involved you without your knowledge. You keep apologizing, she said. I keep being sorry. The quiet that settled between them after that was different from the ones before, less strategic, more personal. Amara was aware of how late it was, or how early, depending on how you measured time underground, and of how long she had been running on adrenaline and clarity, and of how much harder it was becoming to maintain the analytical distance she normally wore like her own version of armor, because sitting across from Aurelian Karnstein in this warm, manuscript-lined room, 3 feet of dark wood table between them and the city asleep outside, she felt something she had been refusing to name for 3 weeks press against that distance with considerably more force than was convenient. She had been drawing his face for 3 weeks. You could not do that, render someone in that much detail, that many times, study the architecture of a person's expressions until you understood what each small change meant, without something accumulating. She was not naive about what had accumulated. She was simply practical about when to address it. You should sleep, he said. The morning will require managing several consequences of tonight, and you will need to be rested. I do not think I can sleep yet, she said honestly. My mind is still running. He nodded, once as though this was entirely understandable. Then I will make tea. It is approximately 3 in the morning. The Conclave will not make their next move until daylight sessions, which does not affect me, but does provide a few hours of administrative delay. The matter-of-fact domesticity of this, a 300-year-old vampire, heir to all of vampire sovereignty, offering to make tea at 3 in the morning, produced in Amara something that was either the beginning of hysterical laughter or the beginning of being deeply and irretrievably fond of this specific person, and she decided it was the latter, and that this was not the moment to examine it at length. She watched him move to the adjoining kitchen, which was modern, she noticed, and fully stocked, because even vampires apparently maintained the appearances of ordinary life in the city. And she turned to a fresh page in her sketchbook and began to draw the room. It was what she did when she needed to think. Drawing grounded her, gave her the focused quiet she needed to process. Her hand moved over the page without much conscious direction, rendering the shelves of manuscripts, the lamplight on the table, the map on the far wall, with its hand-inked routes across a Europe that no longer looked like that, and then, almost before she decided to, the doorway to the kitchen, where she could see his silhouette moving, when he came back with 2 cups, 1 tea, 1 something else that she suspected was not tea. He set them on the table and looked at what she was drawing, and she did not cover the page. He looked at the sketch for a long moment. You draw very quickly, he said. I think in shapes. When I am working through something, the drawing happens by itself. She picked up the tea. I am currently working through whether I am angry at you. Are you? I am working through it. She sipped the tea. It was very good. Of course it was. He had had 347 years to learn to make good tea. I understand why you made the choices you made. I even agree with the logic. But you put me in danger without telling me I was in danger, and that is the part that I need to process. Yes, he said. He sat down, and he did not try to argue or justify, which she was increasingly recognizing as one of the more remarkable things about him. If I could revisit it, I would find a way to warn you without compromising the documentation. I have not been able to identify how. Legally, that could have been done. But I would have looked harder. Amara set down her pencil and looked at him directly. I need to tell you something. All right. When I recognized the crest 3 days ago in the coffee shop, I did not just match it to the heraldic archive. I also spent approximately 40 minutes sitting with what it meant, and by the time I was done sitting with it, I had worked out most of what you told me tonight. Not all of it, but enough. She paused. I knew something significant was happening. I knew the crest was not coincidental. I chose to continue with the commission rather than walk away. His eyes were very still. Why? She held his gaze. Because I wanted to know how it ended. The way he looked at her then. The careful, precise attention of it, like something trying very hard to interpret, something it did not have quite the right vocabulary for, made her feel seen in a way that was simultaneously deeply comfortable and entirely terrifying. That was not the only reason, he said quietly. He was not asking, he was offering her the space to be honest. No, she said, it was not. The silence was different again. Closer. I have been watching you work for 3 weeks, he said. I intended to maintain a professional distance. I had planned for it. The documentation required your presence, but did not require my involvement. But "You are extremely difficult not to involve oneself with," he said, with a precision that made it sound like complaint but carried no complaint in it at all. "You do not perform composure, you actually possess it. You walk into a room full of apex predators with a sketchbook, and you look at them the same way you look at architecture, as something to be understood, not feared. I have never." He stopped. "You have never what?" she asked softly. "I have never met a human who made me feel the necessity of being entirely honest," he said. "Most humans require performance. You make performance feel like an insult." Amara looked at him for a long moment, 347 years old, carrying a secret lineage and a blood oath and the weight of an entire court system in his composure, and sitting here at 3 in the morning, confessing that she made him feel the need to be honest. "Aurelian," she said, his given name, which she had used in her head for weeks but never spoken aloud. Something shifted in his face at the sound of it. "We are going to be in a great deal of danger for the foreseeable future," she continued. "Yes, and you are going to be protective and dominant, and generally inclined to put yourself between me and any source of harm. Inevitably. I need you to understand that I am a participant in this, not a person to be protected from the information or the consequences. I will be significantly more useful and considerably less likely to make decisions you have not accounted for if you treat me as a full partner." He studied her. "You are asking me to trust you. I am telling you that you already do. You hired me because you trusted my work. You chose me specifically because you believed I could handle the truth. Extend that trust to include telling me the truth in advance." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and turned her sketchbook, so he could see the drawings she had been making, the room, the manuscripts, his silhouette in the kitchen doorway, and looked at it with an expression she did not have a name for yet. "I will tell you everything from this point forward," he said. "That is not a diplomatic answer. I mean it, as an absolute commitment." "I know you do," she said. "That is why I believed it before you finished saying it." She did not sleep that night. Neither did he. They sat at the long table in the warm lamplight, and he told her everything. The full lineage, the Conclave's history, the specific vulnerabilities in the blood law framework he intended to use to challenge their authority, the network of allied vampire houses he had been quietly building for decades who would move to support the primogeniture claim once the court record was secured. He told her about his family, the chain of hidden heirs before him, each one carrying the crest and the oath, each one dying without being able to claim what was theirs. He told her about the first time he had understood what he was and what he carried, at the age of approximately 30 years into his immortal life, when the patriarch of the line had sat him down with the Valdris Covenant and explained it with the exhausted gravity of someone passing on a burden rather than a gift. She listened and asked precise, intelligent questions and took notes in the margins of her sketchbook alongside the drawings. And somewhere in the hours between 3 and 6 in the morning, the distance between strategic partnership and something significantly more personal collapsed so gradually that neither of them could have identified the exact moment it happened. What Amara could identify was the moment he reached over and tucked a loose piece of her hair back from her face without appearing to fully decide to do it. A gesture so automatic and unguarded that it was clearly coming from somewhere below his considerable capacity for strategic self-control, and then became very still when he registered what he had done. "I apologize," he said in the precise tone of someone who was not apologizing for the gesture, but was offering her the option to redirect the moment if she needed it. "Do not," she said. He held her gaze for a moment that felt very long and very honest. "Amara," he said. Her name in his voice had a quality to it, measured, particular, chosen, that made her understand this was not a casual use of her name, but a very deliberate one. "We are going to deal with the Conclave first," she said, "and then we are going to deal with this." His expression held something that was close enough to warmth that it rearranged the whole composition of his face. "That is an unusually strategic approach to this. I am an unusually strategic person. You hired me because of it?" "Yes," he said, "among other reasons." The morning came, as mornings did, regardless of what had happened in the dark. Aurelian did not go into the sunlight. She had understood his limits well enough by now to know which rules applied and which were myth. But he operated extensively by phone and encrypted communication while she drafted a formal legal statement documenting the provenance of the Crest sketches and her standing under the neutrality covenant. She was not a lawyer, but she wrote with the precision and clarity of someone who had spent years creating detailed documentation. And when his advocate, a thin, ancient vampire named Casimir, who arrived at 9 in the morning with the exhausted expression of someone who had been awake all night managing a crisis, reviewed her statement, he declared it legally airtight with the slightly surprised tone of someone who had expected worse. "You should have told her from the beginning," Casimir said to Aurelian, in the flat tone of someone who had been saying this for several hours before the night began. "I am aware," Aurelian said. "She's saying the same thing," Amara said pleasantly from across the room. Casimir looked at her with an expression she classified as grudging approval. The Conclave's response came at 11. Not a legal motion, which Amara had expected, but a physical one. 3 of the Conclave's senior guards arrived at the building. They did not attempt to enter because Aurelian's security was too sophisticated for a frontal approach, but their presence was a message, a demonstration of force, a reminder that the blood law violation against Amara had not been formally withdrawn. Aurelian stood at the window, looking down at them. He could not go to the window in direct daylight, so he stood just inside the shadow line, perfectly composed, and looked down at 3 of the court's most dangerous enforcers with the serene absolute calm of someone who had stopped being afraid of demonstrations of power approximately 2 centuries ago. "They will not act in daylight on a public street," he said. "It is a statement." "What does the statement mean?" Amara asked, coming to stand beside him, fully in the light, deliberately, because she wanted the guards to see a human standing unintimidated in Aurelian Karnstein's window. "It means the Conclave is acknowledging that last night did not go as planned, and is reminding me that they have options beyond the legal framework." His voice was steady. "It also means they are worried. If they were confident in their position, they would not need to demonstrate force. We use it then." The morning effectively. She turned away from the window. "Casimir, how quickly can we file the documented Crest evidence with the formal court record? If we move through the auxiliary court registry rather than the main court, which is Conclave-controlled, we can file it today. The auxiliary registry is older than the Conclave. They cannot suppress it without violating a blood law more fundamental than anything they cited last night." "Then that is what we do," Amara said. Today, the day was a sequence of movements, communications, and carefully orchestrated legal filings that Amara participated in with the focused intensity she normally brought to a significant commission. Casimir filed the documentation. 3 of Aurelian's allied houses, the Vorchenov line from Eastern Europe, the ancient Thessian family from the Mediterranean courts, and a smaller but politically significant house called Dravik, whose support had apparently been uncertain until the previous night's events had clarified their position. Formally acknowledged the primogeniture claim in writing. Seraphiel responded by invoking an emergency conclave session for that night. She still held legal ground. The blood law violation charge against Amara was still active, and as long as it was active, the documentation's admissibility remained in dispute. It was Amara who solved the problem. She did it that afternoon, sitting at the long table in Aurelian's study, with her legal statement and Casimir's precedent files spread around her, when she noticed something in the text of the neutrality covenant that both Casimir and Aurelian had apparently read past without flagging. "This clause," she said. "The neutrality covenant protects human observers not only from harm but from legal proceedings in any matter directly arising from their commission. The Conclave argued that my documentation of a forbidden lineage constituted a blood law violation, but the violation they cited falls within the scope of my commission. I was commissioned to document court proceedings, and the lineage reading was a court proceeding. The violation is directly arising. They cannot charge me without violating the covenant." Casimir stared at her. Then he took the document and read the clause 3 times. "That argument has never been made," he said slowly. "It has never needed to be made before," she said, "because no human observer has ever been caught in a lineage dispute. But the text is unambiguous." Casimir looked at Aurelian. "She is correct." Aurelian was looking at Amara with an expression she was beginning to be able to read. The particular quality of his attention when something had genuinely surprised him, which was different from his normal focused composure, and involved a slight softening around his eyes that she suspected very few people had ever been close enough to notice. "You found the argument in one afternoon," he said quietly. "I read carefully," she said. "Or have that argument filed formally before the evening session effectively neutralized the Conclave's leverage. Without the blood law violation charge, they had no grounds to discredit the documentation. Without grounds to discredit the documentation, the true Crest acknowledgement stood in the court record. Without the ability to remove it from the record, the primogeniture claim was legally established. It did not end the political struggle. Nothing in court politics ended that cleanly, but it shifted the ground irrevocably. The evening session was a different atmosphere than the previous night. Aurelian attended. Amara attended with him, standing not in the gallery this time, but at the floor level, beside Casimir, which was a deliberate statement of position that she had insisted upon, and which Aurelian had agreed to after approximately 30 seconds of visible internal conflict between his protective instincts and his recognition that she was right. Lady Seraphiel walked into the chamber, looking like someone who had spent the day calculating losses and had arrived at the number. She was still composed, still precise, still terrifying in the smooth way that very old things were terrifying. But the specific satisfaction she had worn the previous night was gone. The session was formal, procedural, significantly less dramatic in the overt sense. But Amara watched it with the full knowledge of what each procedural motion meant and felt the significance of every exchange like seismic activity measured under an ordinary floor. When the auxiliary court record was read aloud, confirming the filing of the Crest documentation the Covenant Clause argument, and the acknowledgement by 3 allied houses, Lady Seraphiel did not react visibly. She simply sat very still and calculated. "The Conclave acknowledges the procedural filing," she said when it was her turn to speak. "However, the primogeniture claim requires more than documentation to be actionable. It requires a formal challenge to the existing governance structure, which under blood law must be supported by a majority of the major houses. At present, 3 houses have acknowledged the claim. The threshold for a formal challenge is 7. "The threshold is 5, Aurelian said. He had not moved from his position at the center of the chamber floor, and his voice carried the particular quality of someone citing a fact they have known for a very long time. As established in the Solvay revision of the blood law, which amended the governance challenge clause in the year 1682. If the Conclave disputes this, I would invite them to produce the original text of the Solvay revision, which I have had on file for approximately 40 years. Casimir produced the document. It had been prepared, of course. Everything had been prepared. The session lasted 2 more hours. Seraphiel moved through every remaining procedural option with the methodical precision of someone who had been operating in court politics for 6 centuries, and Aurelian met each one with a prepared response, a cited precedent, a filed document. The preparation was extraordinary. 3 of the Conclave members, not Seraphiel, but 3 of the others, whose alliance with her had apparently always been more pragmatic than committed, began voting procedurally in ways that did not support her position. When the session ended, nothing had been formally concluded, no declaration had been made, no transfer of power had occurred. But the ground had shifted visibly, and everyone in the chamber knew it, and Seraphiel walked out without her smile. Aurelian walked out with Amara beside him, and did not speak until they were in the corridor, and then he said, quietly, "You were magnificent. I read a legal document carefully," she said. "That is not magnificent. That is basic competence. You have a gift for understatement. You have a gift for overstatement. We balance." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. They were in the corridor outside the chamber. Stone walls and candlelight, and the distant sound of the court dissolving into the chaos of political recalculation, and he turned to look at her with an expression that was not composed at all, or rather, was composed in the way that a person is composed when they have decided to be honest, and that honesty requires letting go of the performance. "I have been operating alone for a very long time," he said. "Even in my planning, the network I built, the alliances, the preparation, there was no one I brought into my full confidence, no one who knew everything." He paused. "Until last night. Last night was partly my doing," she said. "You were rather forced into it." "Last night was entirely your doing," he said. "You told me to trust you, and you were right, extending that trust was the correct choice in every way that matters." She looked at him. "The Conclave is not finished. No, there will be more sessions, more legal battles, more political maneuvering. The remaining 4 houses need to acknowledge the claim. Seraphiel will find new angles. Yes, this is going to be a long process, almost certainly." She held his gaze. "I am not going anywhere." The look that moved through his face at that was something she would draw later when she had the time and the quiet. Something she wanted to render in careful detail so she could study it and understand it fully, because it was unlike any expression she had seen on him before. It was something that had been kept very carefully away from the light and was not used to the light, and was not entirely sure what to do in it. "I did not ask you to stay," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "That is why I am telling you." What happened then was not dramatic or performative. He reached out and took her hand, very carefully, with the deliberate gentleness of someone who was aware of the difference between what he was and what she was, and did not intend the difference to be a danger. And she let him, and they stood in the corridor for a moment that was not about succession crises or blood law or court politics at all. "This is the part you said we would deal with," he said, "after the Conclave." "The Conclave is not dealt with yet." "No," he said, "but you did not say after the Conclave was completely and fully resolved. You said after we dealt with them first." She looked at him. There was something in his expression that she recognized as humor of the driest possible variety, the kind that lived completely beneath the surface and could only be seen by someone who had been looking closely enough for long enough. "You are using my own words against me," she said. "You did say them." She laughed. It surprised her, a genuine laugh in a corridor full of vampire politics and old stone, and the sound of it changed his expression again, to something she did not have words for, yet but intended to find words for. "All right," she said, "we are dealing with this." "Yes," he said. She reached up and placed her free hand against his jaw, the cool, marble-smooth skin of him, the architecture of a face she had drawn 37 times from memory and knew better than any structure she had ever studied. And he was very still, and then he was not still. And what happened was quiet and honest, and careful in the way that things were when they came from somewhere very deep, rather than somewhere impulsive. It was, she thought, exactly like his apology. No performance, no redirection, simply the thing itself, given without qualification. The weeks that followed were exactly as difficult as they had predicted. Seraphiel attempted 3 more procedural challenges, each one more sophisticated than the last, and each one met with preparation that Amara and Aurelian and Casimir developed together at the long table in the study. Working through the night in the warm lamplight with manuscripts and court records, and her increasingly annotated sketchbook spread between them. 2 more houses acknowledged the primogeniture claim. The Morvain house, a middle power family in the northern European courts, and the ancient Sarian bloodline from the Hungarian territories, whose acknowledgement carried significant symbolic weight because of their historical connection to the Valdres line. 5 houses. The threshold was met. The formal challenge could proceed. It did not proceed without violence. Amara had known it would not, had prepared herself for it. And she still was not fully prepared for the night 2 of the Conclave's guards followed her from Aurelian's building to the art supplies shop. She had been to 3 times a week for 3 years because she refused to let her entire world shrink to the dimensions of a succession crisis. She was not followed by accident. Seraphiel had made a calculation that Amara's physical vulnerability as a human was a lever, and that Aurelian's protective instinct toward her was a weakness that could be exploited. What Seraphiel had not factored in was Amara's own competence. She had noticed the tail within 2 blocks. She had led it through a route that took her past a publicly crowded street rather than any isolated location, had called Casimir rather than Aurelian because she knew Aurelian's response would be immediate and unconcealed, and had entered the art supply shop, where she stayed among people until Casimir's arrival, with 2 of the allied house representatives, made the situation politically untenable for the guards, who withdrew. When she told Aurelian what had happened that evening, his response was the most visibly agitated she had seen him, controlled contained, but with an edge to his composure that communicated clearly that this particular containment was being maintained by effort. "You should have called me," he said. "If I had called you, you would have come out in whatever state of undress the situation required, in public at 3 in the afternoon, and the Conclave would have had documentation of you threatening their guards, which is exactly the kind of political liability they need to stall the formal challenge. I am aware of the political consequences. I would have been willing to accept them. I know you would. That is exactly why I did not call you." She held his gaze steadily. "I handled it. Everyone is fine. The only outcome is that Casimir now has a documented report of the Conclave attempting to intimidate a protected neutral party, which is an additional blood law violation that strengthens our procedural position." He looked at her for a very long moment with those silver eyes. She could see the conflict in him, the protective instinct, centuries old and absolute, battling with the thing he had promised her, which was to treat her as a partner, rather than someone to be shielded from consequences. "You are right," he said finally. It cost him something, she could see that. "I know," she said gently, "and I know it is very hard for you, but I need to be able to move through the world. I cannot be a person who lives in your building and lets you manage every risk." "No," he said. "You cannot. You would not be who you are if you did." He paused. "I reserve the right to be deeply unhappy about specific incidents even while acknowledging that your judgment is sound." "Absolutely," she said. "Your feelings are not the same as your decisions." He looked at her in a way that suggested she had, once again, articulated something he had been circling without finding the words for. "Your feelings about it are exactly right," she said. "What matters is what you do with them." Something in his expression changed to something she had begun to recognize as the version of warmth that existed in someone who had been armored for a very long time and was learning, carefully, that it was safe to let some of it down. "Come here," he said quietly. She crossed the room to him, and he wrapped both arms around her with the same deliberate gentleness he always brought to touching her. The awareness of the difference between them always present in how careful he was, and she pressed her face into the front of his coat and felt the cool solidity of him around her, and exhaled. "I am going to be very old before this succession crisis is resolved," she said into his coat. "The formal challenge hearing is in 6 weeks," he said against her hair. "Once the governance challenge is formally heard and ruled upon by the auxiliary court, whose independence from the Conclave has been re-established as part of the procedural record, the ruling has legal force regardless of the Conclave's position. It will not end the political resistance overnight, but it establishes the legal framework. And after that, the Conclave's authority depends on the continued cooperation of the major houses. Without a majority, they cannot enforce the blood laws that give them power. The houses that have acknowledged the primogeniture claim represent enough economic and territorial weight to make that cooperation structurally impossible. That is the real leverage, she said. Not the court ruling, the houses. The court ruling creates the legal legitimacy. The houses create the political reality. Both are required. He paused. I have been building the house network for decades. The court ruling required you. She tilted her head back to look up at him. I am glad you found me, so am I, he said. Quietly, absolutely, without qualification. The same way he apologized, the same way he loved. She had recognized it some weeks ago and had not been surprised. Love, when it came from someone who was constitutionally incapable of performing emotions they did not have, looked exactly like this, a series of deliberate, unguarded moments, the hair tucked back, the tea made without being asked, the apologies given without negotiation. The promise to tell her everything, kept precisely and completely. The visible cost of respecting her autonomy when every instinct in him wanted to stand between her and anything that could cause her harm. It looked like a person dismantling their armor piece by piece, not because they had been convinced it was safe, but because they had decided she was worth the risk. 6 weeks later, on a night in late November, with the city outside, cold and wet, and the underground court chamber lit with more candles than she had ever seen it hold, the formal challenge hearing took place. Amara sat at the floor level again, not at the observation gallery, but in the body of the chamber with Casimir on her left and the representative of the Vorchanov house on her right. Aurelian stood at the center of the chamber floor, where he had stood on the first night, and he was wearing the Karnstein crest openly now, visible on the lapel of his coat, embroidered with a precision that made it unmistakable to every vampire in the room. The auxiliary court, chief arbiter, an ancient vampire named Talvain. So old he moved in the way of things that had been past urgency for centuries, read the procedural record, the documentation, the covenant clause argument, the 5 house acknowledgements, the Valdris covenant itself, which Aurelian had produced from his own library in the original sealed parchment, intact, the blood seal still present in the wax. Lady Seraphiel made her final arguments. They were excellent arguments. 6 centuries of court experience in every word, every procedural reference precisely chosen. She was brilliant. She was also operating on the wrong side of 4 centuries of illegitimate authority, and no amount of brilliance could change the underlying fact that the Valdris covenant was older than everything else in the room. Talvain ruled. The ruling was 47 minutes long and cited 63 precedents, and was, in Amara's assessment, the most comprehensive judicial document she had ever heard read aloud. But its conclusion was simple and direct. The primogeniture claim was valid. The documentation was admissible. The neutrality covenant protections held, and the Conclave of Seven's authority over the night courts was formally declared illegitimate under the Valdris covenant. The governance of the night courts would return to the Karnstein primogeniture. The transition would require a formal period of 6 months for legal and structural reorganization. During that period, a joint council would govern, including 2 conclave members, because Talvain was wise enough to know that complete exclusion created martyrs and that pragmatic inclusion created management, and because not every member of the conclave had been a knowing participant in the 4-century suppression. Lady Seraphiel received a formal censure and a structured removal from power that took her authority without providing her martyrdom. It was the kind of resolution that Amara suspected was Aurelian's work more than Talvain's. A clean solution that removed the threat without creating a new one. The chamber was very loud after the ruling, loud in the way of things that had been suppressed for a long time releasing. She could not tell at first whether it was positive or a different kind of chaos. Then she registered that the loudness was coming from the House representatives, voices overlapping in what she eventually understood were the formal verbal acknowledgements that the allied houses gave when a governance change was confirmed. Ancient words in ancient languages cascading through the chamber like bells. Aurelian had not moved from the center of the chamber floor. He stood exactly as he had at the beginning of the night, with his hands at his sides and his composure absolute, and received the acknowledgments with the stillness of someone who had been waiting for something for 170 years and had decided that the moment of its arrival did not require performance. Amara looked at him across the crowded chamber and thought about a coffee shop 3 days before the first court session, so sitting with her sketchbook, drawing a crest she did not yet understand. He found her eyes across the room with the same unerring accuracy he had always had, and the expression on his face was the one she had been drawing in her head for months, the one she had been waiting to see fully, without armor or distance, or the weight of everything unsaid. It was not a triumphant expression. It was something quieter than that, and larger, something that had waited a very long time to be allowed. She moved through the crowd toward him, and he moved toward her, and they met in the middle of the chamber floor, amid the cascading voices of the acknowledgment rite, and he took both her hands in his, with the careful deliberateness that had always characterized everything he did, and she looked up at him. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said, and his voice was completely different from every version of it she had heard before. No court composure, no strategic precision, just a voice speaking to a specific person in the only register that mattered. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about this for a moment, which she loved about him, that he took questions seriously enough to actually answer them. "Like something very heavy has been set down," he said. "Like I can breathe in a way I could not before." He paused. "Like I would very much like to leave this chamber and go home." "Yes," she said. "Let us go home." They left together, through the stone corridors, and up through the labyrinth of passages and into the parking structure, and then through the wet London night, the city indifferent and ordinary and entirely ignorant of what had resolved itself beneath its feet. And Amara leaned her head against the car window and watched the city lights blur in the rain and thought about the shape of what came next. "The transition period will be 6 months of intensive governance work," she said. "Yes, I will need staff, a governance council. People whose judgment I trust to help rebuild the court structure." He glanced at her. "I am going to ask Casimir to take a formal role, and several of the allied house representatives." "You should ask some humans," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The night courts have never included human voices in governance," she continued, "and the relationship between the vampire world and the human world is a structural problem that blood law and court politics have been avoiding for 4 centuries. If you are rebuilding the governance framework, you have the opportunity to do it differently. You are thinking about this in terms of something larger than the succession. I am thinking about it in terms of what kind of governance structure actually works across a long time period. The Conclave's authority collapsed because it was built on suppression. Something sustainable requires inclusion." She turned to look at him. "You hired a human to break the legal stalemate that was trapping your lineage. That was not an accident of strategy. That was an insight about where power actually comes from." He was quiet for a long time, watching the road. "I had not framed it in those terms," he said eventually. "That is why you need me in the governance council," she said. He looked at her then, a quick, full look that was followed by a longer one. "You are asking to be on the governance council," he said. "I am telling you that I should be," she said. The corner of his mouth moved as a formal role, with a formal title and actual authority, not as a consultant or an observer. The court will resist the inclusion of a human in formal governance. The court resisted the primogeniture claim for 4 centuries, That is not an argument against it. She held his gaze. You know I am right. I know you are right, he said. I also know that it will make you a more visible target for the political factions that remain hostile to the transition, which is exactly why I should have formal authority rather than informal influence. Formal authority comes with formal protections. Informal influence comes with informal vulnerability. He was quiet again. Then, you have already thought through the security implications, and I have thought through several versions of the structure. I have notes. Of course you have notes. He turned onto the street toward his building, and she could hear something in his voice that was not quite laughter, but existed in the same territory as it. The particular resonance of someone who found the person they were with consistently, genuinely surprising in ways that were entirely pleasurable. I would like to read the notes. You will tonight. Tonight, she confirmed. He parked, and they went inside, and the building was warm and quiet and full of the accumulated weight of the manuscripts and maps and centuries of careful documentation that she had come to know as intimately as her own apartment. More intimately, if she was honest, because she had spent more waking hours here over the last several months than anywhere else. He made tea. She spread her governance notes across the long table. They sat down together in the warm lamplight and worked through the structure, arguing about specific points and finding better solutions in the argument. And somewhere after midnight he moved to sit beside her rather than across from her, which was something he had started doing in the 3rd month, a small, quiet shift in the physical geography of their work that had communicated something neither of them had felt the need to announce. Around 2 a.m, she stopped writing mid-sentence and looked at him. You are going to be all right, she said. He looked at her, and she clarified. I do not mean politically. I mean the other thing, the thing you have been carrying alone for a very long time. His expression shifted to the unarmored one, the one she had finally drawn properly last month, a full rendering in her best charcoal on good paper that she had framed and hung in the room. She had at some point in the past several months begun to think of as theirs. Because of you, he said. Because of us, she said. There is a difference. He turned toward her fully, and his hand came up to her face with the same deliberate care as always. And she leaned into it because she always did, because there was something about being held gently by something that's strong, that worked on a level too fundamental to interrogate. You said you wanted to know how it ended, he said, when you recognized the Crests and stayed with the Commission. I did. How does it end? She smiled at him, a full smile, unreserved, the kind she gave easily to people she trusted, and was not shy about giving to him any more. It does not end. That is the point. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I have spent 347 years learning that most things end. Bloodlines end, alliances end, courts end, even certainties end. He paused, and his thumb brushed her cheek in the careful way he had. You are the first thing that has felt as though it is beginning. Amara put her hand over his, warm against cool, and looked at him in the lamplight. This person she had drawn in charcoal 37 times and would draw 100 more. This ancient and formal and quietly devastating person who apologized without qualification and made excellent tea and had spent 11 years planning a legal strategy that required trusting a human artist, and who was looking at her now with the entirety of 3 centuries of carefully maintained composure put aside. Then we are in agreement, she said softly, beginning. He kissed her in the lamplight with the care and absolute honesty that characterized everything he did, and she pressed her hand against his chest, where a heartbeat would have been in a human, and felt instead the deep, still certainty of something that had existed for a very long time and intended to continue outside. The city moved through the Lsasa Dowers, the ordinary, illuminated, unknowing city, carrying in its underground spaces and sealed chambers and ancient stone corridors the weight of 4 centuries of suppressed truth that had finally, irrevocably, come to light. In the weeks and months that followed, the transition proceeded as Talvain's ruling had outlined, and as Aurelian's decades of preparation had positioned it to proceed. There were political complications. There were always political complications, but the foundation was solid. The allied houses held, and the Conclave members who remained in the joint council found that pragmatic cooperation was, in fact, more advantageous than continued resistance to an authority that was now legally and politically unassailable. Lady Seraphiel withdrew from public court activity entirely, which was either a strategic retreat or a form of acceptance that Amara did not try to psychoanalyze, because some things were genuinely unknowable, and the effort of trying to know them was better spent elsewhere. Casimir took his formal role and demonstrated, as Amara had expected, a thoroughness and precision that the Governance Council benefited from enormously. Amara's position was formalized in the 3rd month of the transition. It generated exactly the resistance she had predicted and was defended by exactly the structural arguments she had prepared, and it passed because the logic was sound and because Aurelian held the line with the particular quality of absolute, unyielding certainty he brought to things he had decided were correct. Her role gave her formal authority over the Governance Council's approach to human-vampire relations, a portfolio that did not previously exist, and that she was building from the ground up, with the accumulated documentation of her sketchbooks and legal notes, and 3 centuries of court records that Aurelian's library had preserved, and with the practical intelligence of someone who had spent her entire professional life studying the way structures worked and the way they failed. She continued to draw. She drew everything: the court sessions, the council meetings, the architectural details of the chamber in its transition from conclave governance to something newer and more honest. She drew Aurelian in all his formal compositions, and in all the unguarded ones she was increasingly privileged to witness. She drew the crests, the bleeding crescent, and the black thorn crown, no longer hidden, no longer forbidden, present now in the main court chamber as openly as it had always been present in the house in Mayfair. She drew the night, 6 months after the formal challenge ruling, when Talvain presided over the final transition ceremony, and the Night Courts formally recognized the Karnstein primogeniture as the governing sovereign lineage, not with absolute power, because Aurelian had structured the governance framework deliberately to distribute authority rather than concentrate it, having learned from 4 centuries of what concentrated authority produced, but with the legitimate sovereignty that the Valdris Covenant had always intended. She drew Aurelian standing at the center of the chamber floor with the crest at his chest and the acknowledgement rite cascading around him, and his silver eyes finding her in the crowd with the same unerring accuracy as always, and the expression on his face that was hers to read. She drew the walk home afterward, the 2 of them in the wet autumn streets with the city ordinary around them, his hand around hers, his thumb moving in the slow, deliberate pattern she had memorized. She drew the house, the lamplight, the manuscripts, the tea. She drew herself into the composition of his life, clearly and without apology, in the same decisive charcoal lines she had always used. In the spring, she completed the full formal documentation of the succession, a bound volume of her drawings from the first court session through the final transition ceremony, accompanied by the written record she had kept throughout, a document that Casimir declared the most comprehensive account of a Night Court governance transition in 4 centuries of court history. It was archived in Aurelian's library. It was also, at his request, archived in the auxiliary court record, the first time a human-created document had been entered into the Night Court's formal historical record. Another thing that had never been done, another beginning. She was working in the study one evening, spring light angling through the high windows in a way that Aurelian could not quite reach, but that she had described to him enough times that he claimed to understand it perfectly. When he came to stand behind her and looked over her shoulder at what she was drawing, it was the crest. She had been drawing it again, not from memory this time, but from the embroidered version on his coat, hung on the back of the study chair, rendered in the finest detail her charcoal could achieve. She was working on the crown of thorns, trying to get the precise weight of each line correct. "You have drawn that approximately 60 times, he said. 83, she corrected. Why? She looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she looked up at him over her shoulder. Because it is where everything started, she said. Because I want to understand it completely. He was quiet for a moment. She felt him lean down slightly, and his lips pressed against her temple with the quiet, deliberate care of everything he did, and he stayed there for a moment. You already understand it completely, he said. You understood it before I did. She set down her pencil and turned in her chair to look at him properly. That is not true, she said. You have been carrying the understanding of it for 347 years, understanding what it was, he said, not what it meant. He looked at her with those silver eyes, clear and unguarded, the composure he wore for the world entirely absent. It meant this, the possibility of beginning something that does not end. He paused. I did not understand that until you, Amara, looked at him for a long moment in the spring light, this ancient and careful and deeply honest person, this vampire who had waited 170 years past his legal deadline because the circumstances were never quite safe enough, and who had found her because he trusted her work before he knew to trust her. I know, she said softly. I know what it means. She took his hand and turned it gently, palm up, and traced with one finger the mark on his inner left wrist, the bleeding crescent, the mark of the Valdres line, present from the moment of his first blood rite. She had drawn it too, many times. It was not a wound or a scar. It looked like a birthmark, soft-edged, permanent, the color of deep water. This is what I recognized, she said, not just in the sketchbook, in you. She pressed her palm flat against his wrist. Before I understood what it was, I recognized it. He turned his hand to hold hers, the cool of him against the warmth of her, the mark of an ancient covenant against the ordinary lines of a human hand, and the thing between them was very quiet and very certain and very complete. Then we recognized each other, he said. Yes, she said, we did. Outside, the city turned in its ordinary rhythms, oblivious and alive, and below its streets and beneath its indifferent light, the night courts settled into the first genuine peace they had known in 4 centuries, built on the foundation of a crest drawn in charcoal by a human artist who had always looked more closely than anyone expected, and a vampire heir who had waited long enough to deserve it. It was, in the end, exactly as it should have been, not a story about power reclaimed, though it was that, and not a story about blood law resolved, though it was that too. It was a story about two people who had recognized each other across an impossible distance and had chosen, deliberately, completely, and without qualification, to begin.